Okay, good evening. Can you hear me at the back? I always have trouble with the microphones. So I'll try and project, but if you can't hear me, let me know. So good evening, welcome to Mile Institute. My name is Martin Coward. I'm Head of School of Politics and International Relations. And welcome to this event on politics, AI and the future of the university with Lord Clement-Jones. We're really pleased to welcome Lord Clement-Jones here for this event. He's a Liberal Democratic peer, an expert in AI and the digital economy, and someone who was Chair of Council of Queen Mary, University of London, up until earlier this year, I believe.
About a month ago.
About a month ago. So if he looks sort of more relaxed than usual, you know why. He joined the House of Lords in 1998 after a distinguished career as a political communications consultant and as a corporate lawyer, including time at London Weekend TV, which is now part of ITV. For those of us who are old enough, will probably remember the LWT logo on various programmes. He was a key figure in the merger of the Liberal Party and the SDP, from which the Liberal Democrats emerged, and is honorary president of the charity Ambitious About Autism. For tonight's discussion, actually, what's most important for everybody to know is that Tim served as chair of the first House of Lords Select Committee on AI in 2016 and co-founded and co-chaired the all-party parliamentary group on AI. This event is sort of close to me as well because we've invited Tim to be our first honorary professor of practice in the School of Politics and International Relations, and he's kindly accepted. And so this is a kind of inaugural event to welcome him into our research and learning community. And I'm hoping that this is one of many events in which his expertise is both helpful for staff and students. Tonight is an in-conversation event with Professor Elke Schwarz. Elke is Professor of Political Theory in the School of Politics and International Relations. She's had a variety of academic positions before Queen Mary, UCL, Anglia Ruskin, Leicester, and she's an expert in many things, but new and emerging technologies, violence, more recently the apocalypse, and all the fun stuff. Her book, Death Machines, which incidentally is one of my favourite titles ever, considers the kind of ethics of military artificial intelligence, and she's currently writing and consulting with a number of kind of organisations, including various militaries, about the kind of implications of artificial intelligence and information and so on. Is it still vice chair of, of the International Committee of Robot Arms Control, which has been a kind of, an absolute pioneer in looking at kind of how international law needs to respond to the question of of autonomous weapons. And so, in that sense, I am really pleased that she's in conversation with Tim about his book on AI and about the kind of wider subject of AI. So we'll have an in-conversation with the two of you, and then we'll have time for questions and answers from the audience after that. So thank you very much, and I'll pass over to Elke.
Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you very much, all of you, for coming, and thank you very much, may I call you Tim?
Of course.
For joining us this evening. It's really an honor, and it's a real pleasure and a great opportunity for me to have this conversation with you tonight on artificial intelligence, on the change in the world to more and more digital systems. Also, we hopefully will get to speak a little bit about lethal autonomous weapon systems.
I knew we'd come to the apocalypse at some stage.
That's right, and it's so close. But I want to start perhaps with the beginning and learn a little bit more. Perhaps you can tell our audience a little bit more about your own career trajectory, what was important to you and your pathway to the House of Lords, to all these projects, political projects that are dear to your heart?
Well, thank you, Elke, and thank you for those opening comments, Martin. Clearly, there's work planned for the future. I can see that, and I'm deeply honoured to be offered an honorary professorship in the school, and obviously, I'd love to stay involved. And it's great to be here today, and especially with Elke, because we've got a lot of common interests. I'm a big supporter of the campaign against killer robots and things of that sort. That's where the rubber really hits the road as far as AI is concerned. But I got involved in politics at university. My parents were both conservatives. As it happens, relevant to today, they met at Bletchley Park, actually. And so, I've got this kind of techie connection. They never said a thing about what they did until the 80s because, they were covered by the Official Secrets Act. But they were code breakers, they were translators of submarine intelligence and so on, or intelligence about submarines gleaned through Enigma, the machine, and so on. So, in a way, I feel I've got a kind of connection, even though I never spoke to my father and mother about what they actually did. But it's still highly relevant. And so, I was kind of brought up as a conservative. I was a conservative at university. And it was only afterwards, really, when I saw a failed government. And let's face it, we'd seen a few failed governments over the years. This was the Ted Heath government. And I thought there must be a better way of doing things. And there happened to be this rather charismatic leader of the Liberal Party called Jeremy Thorpe, who, of course, later was not covered in glory. You only have to read the book, watch the film. But he was the most dynamic individual. And he was very pro-Europe. And, I've always been very pro-European. I was later, I was a very strong Remainer. And this was the time that we had the first referendum to go into Europe in 1973. So, I joined the Liberal Party because they were very enthusiastic about joining. And then later, Ralph Dahrendorf's lectures came along, and he put them in a book called The New Liberty. But the Reith lectures that he delivered as a philosopher, as a professor, as a former commissioner in the EU were absolutely seminal as far as I was concerned, because he actually delivered a philosophy that I've lived by ever since in terms of making sure that it wasn't just about equality of opportunity, it was about life chances that were appropriate for the individual. And it was about not just freedom from, which is a very conservative concept, it was about freedom to, and he called this active liberty. And for me, that is what, I think liberal democracy is about, is you give people the ability to, if you like, fulfill themselves, and education is a very important way of doing that, and that ties in very much with the kind of mission that a university like Queen Mary has. So all sorts of things in the early 70s for me came together. And I've been, a liberal and a liberal Democrat ever since. A liberal until 1988, when I helped to merge the Liberal Party with the SDP, as Martin mentioned. But throughout, it's been pretty much the same kind of philosophy. And that's why social mobility, all those kinds of aspects of what we do here, of what I do in politics, really have a consistency about them. And it may seem terrible, isn't it, that you don't change your philosophy over 50 years, but that's exactly where I am, really.
Well, if it's a good philosophy, then it's worthwhile sticking with it. And of course, this topic of social mobility is very, very dear to us at Queen Mary, and Queen Mary does really an excellent job at fostering social mobility, and it's really good to be embedded in that environment. But you have, of course, also been a champion or very active in your engagement in a range of arenas, right? So from being a spokesperson on health to being a spokesperson in the creative industries. spokesperson for culture, media, and sports, so education, health, culture, creative industries, media. These are all areas or arenas that have seen quite a significant change in the last 2 decades, let's say. Especially as digital technologies, and I'm doing a soft pivot now to artificial intelligence here, but really as digital technologies came in and began to change how we think about things or how we look at things, and your career trajectory experienced all of that, or was quite alive during that transition. How did you perceive that change?
Well, a lot of this is the result of being a creative industry spokesperson. I mean, health was, fantastic to do, but, given that the amount of changes in the health service, it just got overwhelming, really. And I thought, no, I can't, do this forever, because every time we had a new Secretary of State, we had a new set of proposals to alter, to reform the health service. Well, I thought, let's do something which is, bluntly, rather more fun, working with the creative industries. And then the creative industries started transforming themselves round about sort of 2001, when Napster arrived, the digital streaming service. And then, of course, we had iTunes, which came along very shortly afterwards, which was the legitimate way of sampling music, of enjoying music in a digital format. So I could see the world was changing. So I kind of, not exactly then, but certainly round about 2010, I thought, well, I think I better become a digital spokesperson, and the great thing about politics, if you're a little bit ahead of the game, you can reinvent yourself, really. So when we finished the coalition government, because everybody's a backbencher unless you're a minister, in the coalition, and I certainly wasn't going to become a minister. That wasn't what I wanted to do. But in 2015, I thought, right, well, I'm going to make myself the digital spokesperson for my party. And so I've kind of followed that trajectory. And in 2016, I thought, well, look, not nearly enough parliamentarians understand what is happening in the digital world. And it wasn't just AI, it's all sorts of other things, blockchain, you name it, and even thinking about quantum. But with AI, I thought it was really important that we put something together like an all-party group so that then we can try and, if you like, get a better understanding among parliamentarians about what the implications of AI were. And it was a bit like in the kingdom of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. When they came to set up an AI select committee in the House of Lords, they thought, well, who do you think can chair this? Well, he's the guy who's set up the all-party group. So it was a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, but I have no regrets about that at all, because it has been incredibly fulfilling, a bit scary sometimes, but incredibly fulfilling to try and work through the opportunities of AI and the risks, and try and work out how we, take the opportunities but mitigate the risks. And, it's an ongoing battle, basically, and it's speeded up ever since, the arrival in late 2022, I think it was, of things like ChatGPT, the acceleration, which is a great Ray Kurzweil expression, the acceleration of AI has been immense, and just keeping up with what we need to keep up with, whether it's in a university or in business or in the public sector, wherever it is, we all have to be incredibly agile in working with this, whether it's in regulation, whether it's in adoption, procurement, or just generally understanding how we can make use of it in our everyday lives. It becomes more and more important. And, this kind of confluence between AI and the human gets more and more important as time goes on.
Yes. I sometimes wonder whether, the acceleration of the speed with which new technologies are launched and, woven into all kinds of infrastructures and systems, whether that is kind of designed to keep us all a little bit bamboozled about things, and slightly unsure about them. And I think it's really, again, it's very admirable that you have kind of been a pioneer in trying to think about how can we think with a clear mind, with a clear eye about these technologies so that we're not constantly reactive to what is being thrust upon us. So in that spirit, I want to ask you a question that is a very simple question, but I like to ask that question because it doesn't necessarily always have a clear answer. So I would like you to speak about what is AI? What are we talking about?
Well, I think the easy way of describing it is that it's a neural network. It is designed basically to be like the human brain. Now, that wasn't, this is the new AI. The old AI was the kind of so-called expert system where you try and set out rules and so on. But the new form of AI, the neural network, the deep learning involved in training a neural network is entirely different. It learns for itself, basically, rather like, a toddler learns. And this is the absolutely impressive thing. And this is why the whole agenda about how you train AI models is so important. What data are they ingesting? What copyright content are they ingesting, and so on. So this is the utterly extraordinary thing. And there are people like Jeff Hinton with backpropagation who help make AI training even more effective and so on. But, these large language models that kind of seem to suddenly arise in the last couple of years, they are extremely impressive, but they use a huge amount of compute power. They use huge amounts of data, and they cost a huge amount of money to actually put into effect. And then again, suddenly we get a new model, DeepSeek, that seems to defy all the rules. So you can never stand still in this, and that's the beauty of it. You have to stay alert, but try and build yourself a bit of a kind of regulatory universe that tries to encompass the risks involved. And one thing that really irritates me about some politicians is a kind of Pollyanna-ish approach to new technology, as if it's going to sort out everything and it's all going to be wonderful without thinking about what the risks are and how you mitigate them. And I think the two go together, and I've always, and our original AI Select Committee was very clear about the opportunities, but they were equally clear about the risks. And, I still believe that what we need is a proper framework in which we can operate, which delivers public trust on the one hand, and also for those who adopt AI, the certainty of knowing that they're doing it in an ethical and safe fashion. So, I think the two go together, basically.
Yeah, I think this is the beauty of your book. It kind of looks at the technology itself and the opportunities to regulate and with a really clear eye, and I want to come to that in a second. But I wanted to just ask you about, there's been lots happening with AI recently in the UK government kind of environment. Excuse me. I'm just reading through the Strategic Defence Review at the moment. AI is also foregrounded.
Well,
we'll come to that a little bit later.
We can come to that, yeah.
There was, of course, the AI Opportunities Act, which prompted the line that we should mainline AI into the veins of all aspects of the UK, which is quite intense. Where do you see the opportunities with such an approach, and where do you see the risks?
Well, I use AI every day of the week. I use 3 or 4 tools, almost without thinking about it now. They analyze the emails that I get. It produces research results for me. It summarizes documents for me. It produces bullet points, draft speeches. It does a huge amount. I mean, for instance, as soon as I got the Strategic Defence Review, what did I do with it? I put it into Notebook LLM and say, look, give me 10 questions that I need to get our defence spokesperson to put down, asking about the ethical implications of what they're doing in what they plan in terms of autonomous weapons in the Strategic Defence Review, and it comes back with a pretty good thing, and then you work through the ones that you think are the most plausible, and you ask your defence spokesperson to do the necessary. So, and you couldn't possibly do that. So the productivity gains, just for me, are enormous, and I can see that in business. I can see that in for students. I can see that for in the public sector, particularly. But what goes with that is you have to have a level of transparency and accountability for the use of them. And my argument with government, which is ongoing, is that governments need to make sure that the general public knows the decision-making models that are being used in, for instance, the DWP or the Home Office or whatever it happens to be, and that then the decisions are communicated properly, that if you can appeal against the decisions in a proper fashion, or get a human to review, make sure there is a human who's going to review the decision, and so on. But we don't seem to have that commitment. And the trouble with new technology sometimes is people don't trust it. And I don't want a modern form of Luddism to arise. I want people to be able to trust the technology that when it's being used by government or big business or whatever. And I think at the moment we have quite a lot of distrust, basically. And, there's a lot happening out there, people like Foxglove and Big Brother Watch and so on, rightly are challenging government about their use of AI.
Do you reckon that trust would be greater, in technology would be greater if we had trust in the regulatory frameworks?
Yes. Absolutely. And, this kind of idea that, I'm afraid that's my, I'm permanently writing about it, trying to push back on the narrative that regulation is the enemy of innovation. I think that regulation, appropriate regulation, is the friend of innovation because A, it produces public trust, and B, it creates clarity, certainty, consistency for business, for those who adopt it. They know that if they follow the guardrails produced by regulation, that it's going to be ethical, it's going to be responsible, nobody's going to start suing them anytime soon, and that they have an idea about the standards that are being adopted in business, or public sector, or education. I mean, education is an area where, we don't even have enough guardrails there. There are some very good projects like Educate, Rose Luckin and people like that. But nevertheless, we're not there yet in terms of really common standards across the board.
Yeah, I certainly don't trust the LLMs to do the work. So I'm sitting there with my highlighter, print out version of the strategic defense
Absolutely.
review, and I go through every word. And so it'll be a while until I can really trust let's say a large language model, for example, or any kind of like generative AI.
I entirely agree with you, but if it's a closed system and it's only working on what you've inputted, then that's what I rely on. So, but maybe I'll come a cropper one day.
Who knows? But I want to pivot a little bit to the creative industries and the use of generative AI products and large language models, because there's been a significant outcry, and also in the context of the AI Opportunities Act, the question of copyright, and what we should do with that, right? So Sir Elton John has become a spokesperson, if you will, for saying, well, we shouldn't just surrender our rights. At the very least, there should be remuneration for our work being used to train systems and then sold to the consumer ultimately. Where do you stand?
It's such an important aspect, and of course Elton John has gone pretty large on his description of the Secretary of State. But, we've had Paul McCartney, Dua Lipa, what's not to like, basically. I mean, we've had all of the creative industry right across the board. I mean, I can't tell you just how many emails. I'm very close to the music industry, but also I chair the Authors Licensing Collecting Society now. So, they are very, very up in arms about this as well. And it's all about, do we know what big developers, what large language developers are using to train their models? Well, actually, what they've done historically is scrape the internet. They've basically ingested copyright material. It isn't just sort of ordinary data that they've been ingesting that is, if you like, Creative Commons. It's copyright material, which in normal circumstances you would have to pay to copy. and training, and it's becoming increasingly clear. There are, one or two American law cases which are even coming down the track on this, that training is copying. It is, working on material. And it's no wonder that creative artists are really worried that by inputting without compensation, then all you have to do is output. You can do it in the style of, I don't know, Anthony Horowitz or something, produce a new thriller, and Bob's your uncle. You've got an AI-generated book. Well, the quality of AI at the moment, I mean, people relied for about 5 minutes on the fact that AI wasn't very good. I mean, but now AI is getting better and better and better week by week. I have a subscription to something called Poe.com, and virtually every week there's a new more sophisticated large language model that comes along as part of the service. And, producing a novel now is no problem. And Amazon is absolutely swamped with these AI-generated books. And, publishers, ourselves in the Authors Licensing Collecting Society, what we're having to do is develop, fairly sophisticated software that distinguishes whether or not the author of something that purports to be a human-generated book is human or not. Because otherwise, if you have thousands of AI-generated books with these spurious authors, what you're doing is diluting the royalties that are paid out to all of our real human authors. And, so we're having to, in a sense, fight technology with technology now. That's no bad thing. We have to, respond. But it's the transparency of use is absolutely crucial. So we've had this, it's, in the School of Politics, I'm sure they've done lots of studies on ping pong. And I've played political ping pong. I'm not very good at ordinary ping pong, but I've played political ping pong a lot over the years. And, we always get told, the Commons is has primacy. You shouldn't be telling us that you disagree with us and so on. But actually, in the end, governments nearly always compromise because they recognise the strength of feeling. We wouldn't be pushing back on transparency unless we felt very strongly, unless there was a swell of opinion from outside Parliament, and there is. And of course, in the debates, even in the Commons, there hasn't been a single Labour backbencher that stood up and said, we support the government's line on this, So that demonstrates that actually there's something wrong and they've really got to do something. Because otherwise, our creative artists are going to be disadvantaged. And there are people, we've had evidence to the AI and copyright consultation from the large language models that have more or less said we don't believe in copyright. We don't believe that there should be any control over what we ingest in our models. Now, that may be all very fine for their purposes in training and so on, but it ain't very good for the future of the creative human being. And I'm afraid, I always say that when it comes to a contest between human and machines, I'm on the human side, basically.
Yes, me too. Team human all the way.
Yeah, team human, exactly.
But it's a strange pitting of what outweighs what. So, and I want to point to something Nick Clegg has said recently. He said that having to ask artists for their permission to use the work for the training of generative AI models would basically, and this is a quote, kill the AI industry. Is that a bad thing?
I think Nick Clegg's lived in Silicon Valley for far too long. I haven't gone public criticising him, but the fact is, I don't think Nick has a clue about how copyright works. I don't think he's got a clue about collecting societies and how sophisticated their software already is. I think he sees it through the prism of being a former executive of Meta, quite honestly. And of course, we know that Meta, LibGen, which was this sort of scooped up library, was used at the behest of Mark Zuckerberg deliberately without any payment of any form of copyright. So I think, you might get a little bit infected if you've been involved with Meta for too many years.
suspect so too, I'm afraid. I want to come back to your excellent book, Living with the Algorithm. And it's a year old now, I think. And you're really strong on regulation, and I think that's really, really important. And there's a great chapter on autonomous weapons as well. But you kind of land in the book on three aspects that you want to see materialize. That is, regulate AI and algorithms for risk. One is developing skills and understanding, and then foster international cooperation. Now, we've had the AI Safety Summit in the UK. There's recently been the Paris AI Summit. Where are we with these three recommendations? How optimistic are you with your pathway forward?
Well, I think regulation is in a real mess, country by country. I mean, I'm told that even the EU, which was a bit of a flagship on the AI Act, rather overcomplicated, but nevertheless, the risk-based approach to regulation is one I very strongly support. It looks as though they're going to put a bit of a pause on the AI Act because, you know, there's a bit of a pushback against the complications involved and so on of being regulated. And it may be the generative AI models that are pushing back on it. I don't know whether it's, you know, directly from the sort of Silicon Valley tech bros or what quite, you know, what the underlying reasons are, but there is that rumor, which, you know, is going to create a lot of confusion because, you know, you need that sort of understanding that, you know, a market of 450 consumers means something. And, you know, the Brussels effect was going to kind of create a climate where people felt they had to, it's a bit like GDPR with data protection, you know, where people felt, yes, I know, I've got some idea going forward what I need to do. And that doesn't seem to be happening. And in the States, we have completely gone the other way. And, you know, currently in a bill in the States, Trump's one big beautiful bill, there is a plan to say no tech regulation for 10 years. I mean, if that isn't extreme, I don't know what is, you know, and which will stop all the individual states from having any kind of AI regulation. And then, you know, you only have to look at other countries. Actually, strangely enough, China has more regulation of AI models than most countries, and some of it's quite sensible. South Korea, very sensible legislation, but it's not consistent. And therefore, what you have to do is say, well, look, where do you get a common factor? And the one takeaway for me is the fact that international cooperation in standards, not the great sort of Bletchley Parks or the Paris summits or the Seoul summits, it's the quiet work that's being done by the OECD and the One AI group of experts to try and make standards consistent. So, for instance, getting a single global standard for risk assessment, standards for testing, training, and so on. So people have the assurance, whatever the you know, the regulation as such, that business can then say, look, these are the standards, we're going to adopt them, and we'll create this level of public trust. But, you know, governments and politicians, I think, really, it's almost like they're frightened in the face of tech. You know, we keep being told it's too early to regulate. Oh, we don't know what AI is going to do, and surely, you know, and then we have AI Safety Institute set up, and then we change the name because we don't think AI safety is the right word. We've changed the name of the new institute to the AI Security Institute. Well, give us a break. I mean, you know, it's just hiding in plain sight that we need to do something much more robust, really.
Yeah, you mentioned the tech bros a couple of times, right? And so it really feels that politicians can do their thing, but there's a different power at work. There's a international political cloud or power at work with large corporations that really have the world's largest market caps. All the top 5 are all technology companies like Meta, Google, Amazon. They have such a big role in crafting and creating infrastructures that I often feel like the politicians cannot help but be on the back foot. And those kinds of companies are not maybe sometimes they say, okay, well, we are in favor of regulation, but really in practice, that's not really materialized.
Yes, well, I think our Secretary of State, Peter Kyle, started off on the wrong foot when he soon after he came into the job, he said, you have to treat these tech companies with statecraft, i.e. you almost had to treat the big tech companies as if they were foreign countries and you were, diplomatically entertaining them. Well, to me, that's complete nonsense. I mean, the big issue, which I don't think yet has been properly grappled with, I mean, competition regulators in Europe and here have addressed the issue to some extent. But when you look at the internet and when you look at the digital world, you find that things like cloud services, the platforms, search, so many other things, they tend to concentrate, and you find there are only one or two players, and in some cases one. I mean, until the advent of AI search, Google was really, we had DuckDuckGo and one or two other things, but nothing of any significance. And Bing, even Microsoft Bing, didn't really cut the mustard in that sense. So there's this tendency to concentrate, and that's exactly what's happening in the AI world. If you thought about it, the OpenAI, Anthropic, Llama from Meta, and then you think Gemini, Google, Microsoft, but Copilot or whatever. But there's so many cross investments too, and this is the really complicated thing. The big tech companies, the companies like Google and Microsoft and so on, have cross holdings in these big large language model developers. And again, that causes concentration as well. So I'm not sanguine at all about that. And I think that, we've got the CMA at the moment, the Competition Authority, doing work on things like cloud services and app platforms and so on. Well, that's great, but they really, they're behind the curve on that. The horse has bolted. What they've got to do is think about the new things coming down the track. So they should be looking at the AI developers and saying, look, does the fact that you need these big data centers, you need a lot of data, you need big compute, exacompute to do this, does that mean that you're inevitably going to concentrate? Or do we think that actually DeepSeek is the model for the future, where actually you can develop these models without having all those resources? Somebody needs to take a view about that in our competition authorities. And, I always feel we're behind the curve.
It doesn't help that there's an enormous amount of money in private equity interested in financing these endeavors and have different structures of getting their returns.
Well, the interesting thing is, I don't think they're getting their money back at the moment. I mean, the fascinating thing is nobody's making any money. Google's still making huge amounts of money from its digital advertising and so on, and cross-subsidizing its developments and so on. But, OpenAI still not making any money. Anthropic not making any money. Llama's funded by Meta, which is making digital advertising money. But, it's going to be very interesting to see whether or not, at the end of the day, these large language models actually become a commodity. So they're out there for all of us to use. They probably hallucinate more and more and more over time if they're, sort of almost feeding on themselves in terms of content. But, it is quite a big question as to where the real economic power is going to come from.
Well, so in my research, I've been looking at the crossover from civilian technology to the defense sector. And it would look as though everybody wants to have a slice of what is a really large global defense market at this point. So Meta has a defense product. OpenAI is getting stuck in with defense. Amazon Web Services, of course, provide cloud services. Google has a long-standing contract. And then smaller but very aggressive newcomers that build the digital infrastructures. So in 2023, you chaired the Special Inquiry Select Committee on AI in Weapon Systems. And there was a final report, which was titled Proceed with Caution, with AI and weapon systems, which I was happy to contribute to the evidence for this report. But it seems nobody's proceeding with caution in this arena. What are your thoughts?
I didn't even agree with proceeding with caution, but you know, they're committees. You have to, you know. I was the instigator of the inquiry, but I didn't actually chair it. If you instigate an inquiry, sadly, you're not allowed to chair it. I would have loved to have done that. But, you know, the conclusion we came to, and we interrogated the government pretty heavily, is that we did need an international treaty on this, or at least we needed movement towards an international treaty. You know, and some of the great people out there like Stuart Russell were very, very convincing about the need for this. You know, it may seem a little bit pie in the sky, but, you know, having treaties on things like biological weapons, on nuclear weapons, what you do is that means you define the outliers, basically, and that's what we need to do in this case. And yet, in the Strategic Defence Review, I mean, there are lines there saying, oh, we need more autonomous weapons with greater lethality and all this kind of stuff. So all the stuff we were being told by government, yeah, we've got a great set of ethics, we think the international human rights law is fit for purpose, you know, we think our reviews of human rights law, Article 39 reviews, they're called, are fit for purpose. There'll always be human engagement whenever we use autonomous weapon systems and so on and so forth. But I'm sorry, we don't have a definition of what an autonomous weapon system is, which always struck me as being a bit weird. How could you say what an autonomous weapon system would do or not do, or whether it was ethical or not ethical, unless you could define it? But here we have the government in a successor government, a new government, not the old one, saying pretty much the same thing, saying, but we want more of it. And so, you know, one of the big questions is how will our own government, let alone governments elsewhere, and we've seen what's happened in Ukraine, and, you know, digging underneath the surface is very difficult, you know. We may all applaud what Ukraine has done in terms of destroying planes on the ground and so on and so forth. But were they autonomous? Were they not autonomous? You know, things of that sort. I would feel much more comfortable if I knew there was a set of international rules that people abided by, at least tried to abide by. Now, you know, you might say in extreme circumstances where the technology is novel, there might be an excuse for not using, for not necessarily following that. But I just think that if you've managed to do it for nuclear weapons, you've managed to do it for biological weapons, at least we should try in this respect. And I think that some of the statements in the new SDR, I believe in digital warfare, but I think some of the statements are still quite chilling.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I will be writing on that in the near future. I mean, what we've been trying to do for the last 10 years, the last decade or so, is really arrive at a way by which we can agree on the fact that nobody wants autonomous weapons that cannot be controlled in a meaningful fashion. Perhaps most people would not want autonomous weapons that target humans specifically.
No.
But we can maybe agree on some other kind of level of autonomy. So it's been a long time coming, but...
Yes, that's very interesting, because actually the distinction is being made, the fact that the drones that Ukraine has recently used in Russia, in all those different bases, no human was targeted. It was only planes that were targeted rather effectively. So, I mean, yes, but then you have to have a discussion about that, you know, and I'm afraid the UK has not been very good at promoting discussion, whether in the, you know, Conventional Weapons Committee or in the First Committee or in the UN General Assembly. And we know the UN Secretary General is very keen to see a framework convention in place next year.
Yeah, next year. The time's running out, actually.
Time is running out, yeah.
I want to pivot back to something less doom-laden, although actually you might argue with that. And I want to talk a little bit about AI in education environments. How do you think universities should respond to large language models, the use of artificial intelligence, you know, bringing in the AI opportunities, but also really being mindful and attentive to the many risks, including the fact that we hear more and more studies that attest to a relationship that we have to AI especially large language models, in which our own cognition deteriorates and we lose critical thinking, critical skills. So I think this is one of the greater risks that we should perhaps be mindful of. And then also in an environment where the climate is already quite challenged as it is, and we know that large language models, ChatGPT, for example, one query of ChatGPT requires 500 milliliters of water. The data centers required to run ChatGPT take up as much energy as 117 nation states annually. So it's an enormous energy consumption and environmental impact. How should we, as responsible educators, deal with these factors about AI?
I'll come to the environmental issues later, but funny enough, you've touched on a really important subject, which I was talking to our wonderful Vice Principal for Education earlier about, because this is a really big issue. But I am actually quite optimistic in that respect. There's a wonderful HEPI booklet that's only just come out this week. I don't know if anybody follows HEPI here, but the Higher Education Policy Institute. They say, how is the campus university going to be impacted by AI? Well, you see, I don't think it's going to be about keeping all that stuff in your noddle. It's going to be about marshalling the facts and about critically appraising the facts and then producing arguments. It is the critical faculty that I think we need to cultivate. And I do agree there is an issue about over-reliance, but I think as long as we're transparent about how we're using these tools, I think it's going to be really important that we do use them in universities. Prompt engineering at its core, this whole way in which you interrogate large language models, is an art form. I mean, it's something that, we have to learn, and how you get the best possible output from a large language model is something that can be taught. And then once you've learned that, that's one of the skills. The other is, well, how do you assemble information? How then do you work on the information in a critical fashion? And then produce a set of arguments or whatever it may be. But I think you have to be clear about what the stages are and about how much, what tools you're using and so on. But, for instance, Daniel Susskind, who I've got a huge amount of time for, The Economist, in this, he says, well, a third of our time in schools and universities needs actually to be devoted to learning how to work with AI. Now that's quite a radical view, but we talk a lot about employability for our students, and frankly, with the tools of AI, that makes people more employable. I agree about the over-reliance, but I think we just have to accept the fact, rather like, we're dependent on smartphones for finding our way around now, in doing other things with our smartphones, that's a fact of life. And, we're going to develop new skills that people wouldn't have dreamt about even 5 years ago.
Yeah, with the dependence on smartphones is interesting because I find in the last year or so, Google Maps has deteriorated, and I find myself lost more often than not. So I wonder whether we need to develop a way of having a plan B when the apocalypse inevitably will hit and the infrastructures will crumble, and we have to rely on interpersonal relationships and communication.
Yes. Well, that's a huge impact on society. And in a funny sort of way, because of the pandemic, that was accelerated. So this kind of virtual relationship we have, has its pluses and minuses. But I think the threat of isolation is quite a big deal. But just, in passing, we all used to carry a copy of the London A to Z in our bags.
Yeah.
That dates anybody of a certain age, doesn't it? But, that's what we all used to carry. If we had to go somewhere, we looked at the A to Z. Now, we may have to bring it back, perhaps,
Well, you took your environment in a different way because, you had to look at street names and you have to, not necessarily navigate with the sun, but at least have a spatial sense of where things are, rather than a kind of like an interface that always already directs how we see things and what we see in some ways.
Perhaps we send everybody on orienteering courses or something.
This is what I have in mind, some plan B kind of activity. But speaking of nature, you mentioned you wanted to come back to the environment. I mean, it is a significant point that the planetary impact of these technologies.
It's unbelievable, the impact. I mean, somebody's produced some figures relating to a data center in Northumbria, which BlackRock is investing in. And the figures seem to show that the emissions are going to be as great as Birmingham Airport. Now, that is absolutely extraordinary. So, you know, the very minimum must be that the energy produced that is going to power that data center has to be renewable energy, basically. And I think, you know, there are ways of getting through this, but what I wouldn't want to see is saying, no, sorry, no more development of these data centers. But I do think that you have to be cognizant about the water use, which is absolutely enormous, and you have to be cognizant about the energy use as well. But of course, you know, we don't know. I mean, in 5 years' time, it may be suddenly, it's a bit like Moore's law or something. We suddenly find that you don't need all that extra compute, or, you know, here we are in our AI Opportunities Action Plan, you know, talking about extra compute and how we're going to do all this and that, the other. And in 5 years' time, we may find we don't need that amount of computer power. It may all be, you know, much easier. The semiconductor that NVIDIA produce will be that much more efficient, and so on and so forth. Now, I can't tell the answer to that. Quantum computing may get us there, for all we know. So I think, you know, betting on just data centers, I think, is not going to be sensible. And I think we do need to scrutinize it. But at the same time, you know, do we need a small nuclear reactor? You know, one of these, they've got a competition going on at the moment. Is that the way to power? You know, if we regard that as relatively renewable, or do we expect, you know, to have a solar farm next door to the data center? But you're quite right. People are not thinking about that enough.
Yeah, I'm thinking in particular with the water usage, because it's already an issue in the UK in particular. And I've learned a couple of days ago that the data centers need fresh water. It can't be reused or any kind of, you know...
desalinated
it has to be fresh water, which then, of course, taps into resources that are already scarce or potentially will become scarce relatively quickly. Now, there has been this line bandied about that soon enough we'll have AI powerful enough to solve the climate crisis. So we should just throw all our resources into AI and just keep our fingers crossed that soon enough it'll fix it.
That sounds like a very, well, it's not quite Trumpian, because they don't believe there's a climate crisis, but it is this kind of Trumpian view that you just go hell for leather with new technology, and it's the kind of equivalent of drill, baby, drill, isn't it, really?
It is, but interestingly, it was the former Google CEO, Eric Schmidt, who also is heavily invested in defense products, who said that last year.
He's quite gung-ho.
Yeah, very much so. Well, Tim, thank you very much for your time this evening and for the fascinating conversation. I'm delighted that you have accepted the role of Honorary Professor of Practice. I hope to continue the conversation. But for now, please join me in thanking Laura.